Today, but 1 year ago, I looked in the mirror and was quite disappointed. Do you know those projects that you completed and were actually pretty proud of the result, but over time a few things stand out that could just be better? The violet cycling sweater I made 1 year ago is one such project for me. Unfortunately, it did end up being too big, and due to the binding also too stretchy. Furthermore, I didn't consider that my shoulders aren't as wide as my chest is, and the original pattern did not account for that. As a result, the shoulders are very wide and the heavy sleeves pull them down even more. I still like the sweater very much, but it should be worn with a corset or just for a couple hours without moving that much. But I wanted to make a better version and I had many ideas, so I decided to knit another one. This time with a wonderful green yarn, which was dyed again by my mother. I'm especially fascinated by cable knits and the traditional Aran sweaters, so I thought I'd try to combine them with the original cycling sweater shape. Both styles showed up around the same time and had widely different purposes. The Aran sweater was allegedly created with the purpose to overcoming the extreme poverty of Aran fishing families and was made to be exported as a traditional looking garment for special occasions. The cycling sweater, on the other hand, was made for the sporty woman and had to be practical and hard wearing. Nevertheless, since I'm not using the sweater in this original context, I found the idea of combining it quite thrilling. I started knitting the sweater and here is the front already. Just kidding. I'm working without instructions in this case, or rather, I'm using notes I made while knitting the first sweater as a reference for the silhouette. Then I'm adding the new elements of the cable knits. A big part of the work was to calculate how many rows and stitches I need, and I made many mistakes. Since I didn't consider that this sweater has a completely different binding than the first one, I ended up with too less or too many stitches and had to remake the first knitting 3 times. This was quite a challenging part for me because I had this idea of how I wanted it and it just didn't work out. But I went through and remade it every time. I could have made a swatch, it would have been quite smart, but I thought it wouldn't help since the different patterns are all over the sweater and would behave differently anyway. So I chose the rather frustrating path and unraveled it rather than making many swatches. The thing I really struggled with is the fact that I have quite a pronounced bust, but a small back. So I always have either too little material at the front or too much at the back. Luckily, my mother came up with the idea to create a kind of dart by knitting shortened rows just at the front. Here you can see those 12 rows which join on the sides almost like a sewn dart would. Once this was sorted out, I continued to knit the décolleté and add the last braid for the collar. Again, I chose to make a high-standing collar, typical for the cycling sweater of the time. I also turned the braid from the front to the back so that the turned part would show the braid the right side around. Now that the bodice was finished, I started knitting the sleeves, which actually took months. I am apparently no great fan of knitting plain patterns and I really had to push myself in order to get to the point where the braids for the cuffs started. It definitely didn't help that these sleeves are extremely large and therefore take a lot of knitting. Knitting the sleeves was quite fiddly because of those many needles, but once I was accustomed to it, it really went well. and after quite some time I had almost finished the entire sleeve. The second sleeve went quite well until I realized that I had forgotten to reduce some stitches, so I had to redo the cuff part once again. But fortunately I learned the technique of adding a lifeline to the point where I want to stop the unraveling. It's basically picking up the stitches of the row where you want to stop the unraveling. I think I'm quite good in unraveling garments now. And as you can see, the lifeline works perfectly. Now I went on again and knitted the rest of the sleeve, which took, as always, quite a while. But luckily, finally I got them finished. I reassured that the sleeves are exactly of the same length, and then I started binding off the last row. I love this part of the knitting process, because once the needles are taken out of the garments, it's really a garment. Then I only had to sew those pieces together, and I procrastinated on it quite a bit, because, well, there was no actual reason to do so. I used the same thread I knitted with, I just split it in two so that it is finer and won't create bulk at the sewing line. There are many ways you could sew together the knit, but I chose the backstitch in order to make a stable sewing line and to avoid that the sweater loses its shape. The last step was to sew on the buttons. With the first cycling sweater I realized that it's easier to first sew the button in and then the sleeves, so I did this first. Then I reinforced the buttonholes to make it smaller and also to make them stronger. The last step was to add some transparent buttons to the inside, because when you flip over the color, the beautiful buttons would be hidden. I closed the buttoning with the transparent buttons and the beautiful buttons are on the outside. Then I gathered the upper part of the sleeve into a big double box pleat and sewed the entire sleeve into the armhole. But before I sewed the sleeve into the armhole, I decided to sew the box pleat into place in order to secure it and make it stay where it should. I didn't change the size of the sleeves, and that's why I ended up having again drooping shoulders, and unfortunately I thought changing the bodice would suffice in order to avoid it, but I couldn't test it, and once the sleeves were knitted I didn't want to remake them once again. So now I have to figure out another solution in order to keep those shoulders on my shoulders. Maybe with some tape, or I will come up with another idea. I will let you know. I've actually finished the sweater so I could show it to my mom. I went to visit my parents and I wanted to finish it before that day. And when I was there, I basically didn't take the sweater off again. And is there anything better than strolling through a garden and picking some apples, or walking along the beach and finding some creepy souvenirs? I think not.